We're going to talk about a phased approach. And this is my suggestions for the first phase. So this would be your MVP, and this is mostly out of the box components with a simple integration. And here's why. Here's why. You still have to train people. They still have to start using the system. That's going to add risk as well because they're not familiar with the new system. There'll be some new processes as well. Because typically that's what happens when you use it mostly out of the box system. And so if you can do that, and that's your phase one, then you can quickly in 3 months come out with your phase two, which has maybe expanded integration. So maybe you have a one-way integration in phase one that becomes a bidirectional integration in phase two. Maybe you deploy for one team, and then in the second phase, you deploy for 3 more teams because you have experience in the company in that one team. Deploying it for the other teams is going to be a lot easier. And then phase three is where I go and add integrations and add features. So every phase after that would be a new integration, a new feature. But it would be what I would call a slow roll. And my rule of thumb is, again, you're going to do all the design up front. So the construction component should take no more than 3 months. So you may spend 4 to 6 months planning. Actually, it's more like, if you're really fast, it's about 2.5 months of planning. If you're not, it's 6 months of planning up front. But then after that, every phase, every construction and deployment should be about a 3-month cycle. So how do you do this technique for figuring out what's in each phase? And so I'm going to walk you through how we do it. There's a diagram called a Moscow diagram, which was actually used for development of software in the 70s that we've reincorporated. And M stands for must have, S has should have, C is could have, and won't need. And what we do is we literally take every feature and use case and map them into those categories. And there's some guidelines. You can't have everything a must have. That's the first rule. I've seen people say, well, we must have that. Oh, we must have that too. But if you start to talk to people about it, a lot of things that are musts are shoulds. And so this will help you figure out what has to happen in phase one. It'll end up being almost every must and maybe a couple shoulds. But it also lets you figure out what's in phase two and phase three. And with every piece of software, what you want to do is you want to turn off the features that you're not using. So the won't need will literally be the features you hide inside the product so that people don't play with them because they're not important to the way you want to run the company. The next thing we do is this thing called a user story map. So a user story, we take every one of those musts have, and that becomes this little yellow thing over here at the top. And what happens is we say that item breaks down into a series of subtasks. And those subtasks can be done sometimes in phase one, sometimes they can be done in a later phase. So, for example, if you wanted to do, say, something like an activity tracking, you might have, activities and activity reporting in phase one, but then potentially add the outcome of those activities in a phase two, for example. And so you can take a particular feature and break that down into a whole bunch of user stories, and those user stories can be prioritized. So you'll have some user stories that are 100% require a prerequisite user story. So all those that have to be in the first phase and their prerequisites become phase one or the MVP. Everything else can be deferred and looked at a different time. And so we use this style of mapping to figure out what's in phase one, what's in a later phase, not necessarily phase two. And then the last thing we like to do, if we have the time, is to do what we call a customer experience map. So one of the things when you start building out your solution, and you can, by the way, do this as a user experience as well. Don't think of this just as customer, use it as user. Um, when you have a process, you want to ask yourself, does the user or does the customer feel good, neutral, or bad about each step of the process? And so this one here is an example from I grabbed that was filling out a loan app, but you can do you should really be starting to think about, this is a neutral step, this is a positive step, this is a negative step, and you should be doing that for your customers as you're building these systems. You certainly don't want everything to be red, right? That's not going to help you make money, right? You want to make everything as positive as possible. But the same thing goes for the people using the system. If they have to go through a series of steps, and on those steps, say I have to duplicate data or put it in a different system or stop what I'm doing here and jump to a different system there, those are going to be negative experiences for them and will actually cause risk to the project because it requires them to do things that you would that they don't want to do. And so one of the things you can do is sit down and as you go through the design phase and talk about how you're doing things, you can ask them, what do you think of this? Is this good? Is this bad? Is this neutral? It's just a simple process. And then you can come back with, well, what's the outcomes and what's the consequences of this? So this is sort of how we go about around figuring out what's in our MVP.